So just quickly on each salon, this is our third salon. It's our last of 2021, but we'll be back in the spring. Very, very briefly, the Platform Economies Research Network started sort of as a reading group. We now have members all over Canada, the United States, Australia, Europe, and there's so much interest. So we just decided to kind of open up our conversations, and these really are conversations. There's not going to be a big presentation to live stream, so people can come in and join us virtually. So our focus is very much on data and value, how various data forms become various forms of value. That's the thread, but we cover all sorts of research subjects. Today, I'll let Leila introduce James and Angèle. We'll be looking at news media. And Leila, do you want to take over and do introduction?
Yeah, so thank you, Angèle and James, for joining us at the virtual salon. I'm Leila, a PhD student in anthropology. And I have the pleasure of introducing the two of you today. Angèle Christin is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Stanford, and she is also affiliated with the Sociology Department and program in Science, Technology, and Society. Her research examines how algorithms and analytics transform professional values, expertise, and work practices. She published a new book last year entitled Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms. James Meese is a senior lecturer and research fellow at the Digital Ethnography Research Center at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. He is also an associate investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. James' research examines media law and policy and the algorithmic distribution of news. He's also the author of Authors, Users, Pirates, Subjectivity, and Copyright Law, as well as Death and Digital Media. So with that, I'll invite Angèle and James to give a short introduction about how they arrived at their research agenda, their current work in progress, and also if there's anything that you would like to discuss with us, any specific questions that you would like to discuss with us. And then after your introductions, I'll hand over to Andy to moderate the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the invitation to chat today. I'm really excited about it, and I have lots of questions for the group as well. So that's a great place to start. So let me tell you a tiny bit about my research and how I think trying to connect it to the question of data and value that you mentioned in the introduction. So I'm a sociologist by training and an ethnographer, which means that I do interviews and observations with people. That's kind of my original training. And over the past 10 years, I've been looking at what I've called algorithms in practice, which is not so much the internal structures of how algorithmic systems and platforms are built, but more how people use them in their daily lives, in their daily work, and kind of what happens when people do that. The impetus behind this specific angle of research on algorithms is not new. It relates back to the question of the logic of practice and what happens when kind of technocratic schemes get implemented on the ground, and how the ways in which people put them to specific uses can actually change pretty significantly the original, shall we say, values that were embedded into these socio-technical systems to pretty different kinds of uses and consequences on the ground. So I've been looking at this question of algorithms in practice in several contexts. I like comparisons. I love comparisons. And so I keep comparing pretty random stuff, honestly, but, keeps me busy and interested. So my main project and the core of my most recent book is journalism. So I've been doing this comparison of French and American web newsrooms, looking at how journalists in the two countries use and make sense of what's called web analytics. So web analytics being this kind of real-time software programs that provide kind of granular data and information about what readers are doing when they visit a given website. There are a lot of such analytics software programs. The most popular one at the time I was doing fieldwork was called Chartbeat. Actually, the Chartbeat offices are a couple of blocks away from the new school, fun fact. And so I kind of did a lot of field work trying to see how using these new forms of data about online audiences changed the dynamics of newsrooms. And the kind of main, 2-minute, the 10 seconds finding is that, contrary to discourses about kind of global standardization and homogenization and a kind of diffusion process from the top to the bottom, and the kind of commensurations that you would expect from the literature on quantification and technology to a large extent, it turns out that there are significant differences depending on the institutional context where these tools are being deployed. And so concretely, in my book, I developed an argument showing that French and American journalists make sense and use these metrics in very different ways. And I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions, of findings that I relate to the different histories of the journalistic fields in the two countries, and specifically to the ways in which French and American journalists understand both the public and their relation to the public, but also kind of a professionalism in relation to commercial pressures, which is a kind of nexus that looks pretty different in the French and the American context, in big part because in the French context, the state is an extremely significant actor in shaping the news ecosystem. So that's kind of my first big project. Then I did a second project on criminal justice, looking at how judges and prosecutors use predictive algorithms and data to make decisions about sentencing. This is a bit less relevant for what we're talking about today. But my current project, which I just wanted to put on the table, also because it is relevant, is about influencers. And so there the question is, when you have workers, so in that case, influencers, so influencers being people who create content and seek to make a living by creating content on social media platforms such as Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, whatever. So basically workers who are like completely fully present on platforms. What happens when the kind of work process and the communication process is fully mediated through social media platforms? And so I've been thinking a lot recently about the kind of like continuity between journalists and influencers and the process of like unbundling that it reflects, right? As in like compared to like newspapers, which used to be a unit, the newsrooms I studied already, kind of individual journalists were making sense of metrics in different ways and kind of posting on Twitter and just like living their own little personal brands kind of on social media. And influencers are just taking that to the next level in the sense that they don't have the kind of umbrella organization for the production of content, right? They're entrepreneurs in that way. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about. Just to conclude, thinking about the question of data and value, I guess that my main take on the kind of relationship between these two terms and these two kind of concepts is perhaps not exactly the ones that is at the core of your interrogations, but I'm interested in like values with an S mostly, as in like when people kind of use data, live through data, make a living with data, people and organizations, how does that change the kind of professional values that they, knowing that obviously professional values is, is a bit of a rough or coarse term, but how does that change their professional identities and the ways in which they make sense of their work, right? How does it change their repertoires of evaluation? How does it change their kind of interactions with other workers, with the audience, etc.? And so perhaps I'll stop there, not to take too much time, but I'm happy to unpack any different part of that short overview.
Hey, I can step in now. Thanks so much to Pern and everybody for inviting me along. I've been looking forward to this discussion. I also just want to acknowledge the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the First Nations of the various places we're coming from today. So I'm a media and communications scholar, and my work is mainly focused on the relationship between media industries, policy, and digital tech. Because of this means my work hasn't always been interested in journalism, but I think like Angèle has played out in a range of different sectors. So, my main original focus was the debates around copyright law around the 2000s and 2010s. I was interested in how different claims were being made in relation to the use, reuse, and distribution of cultural products. And this led to a series of different visions of authorship, use, and theft, and claims about what these kind of visions meant. And this was a PhD thesis that ended up as a book, Authors, Users, and Pirates, for MIT Press. And then I didn't really know what to do. So I spent a few years dabbling in different aspects of communication policies, so telecommunications reform in Samoa. I've got some work on privacy and data protection and subscription video on demand as well. But it soon became clear to me, much later than everybody else, I think, that the relationship between news and platforms was intensifying. I went 2016, 2017, the Tower Centre launched their platform press reports, but domestically in Australia, it became clear that there was a growing movement for reform in this area. And this was really early stage and kind of, signals on the wind. But by the time I started this work, this ended up becoming the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry, which is one of the, one of the, not the leading, but one of the leading efforts to kind of regulate and hold technology and platform companies accountable in some way. So I wanted to explore these issues from a variety of angles, and I was particularly cautious of the claims, like Angèle, in a similar way, that these kind of algorithms and the algorithmic distribution that was enabled by Facebook and Google, particularly their newsfeed algorithms and search algorithms, were impacting the media industry in the same way. And there was a lot of concern at the time in the literature that, Google and Facebook would become editorial, that they would somehow impact on the decisions being made by editors in the newsroom. They would shape distribution pathways for news, etc. And I think, perhaps unsurprisingly, like Angèle, I found that, through interviews, through big data studies, obviously, these algorithms have diffuse impacts. News genres are different, for example, news business models are different, and they have long institutional histories that inform their kind of orientation and engagement with digital platforms. I also examined policy developments, which is kind of, slightly less relevant to this group potentially, which are moving at a rapid clip in Australia. But this is also really a study of business models and markets. So, how does the news actually make money? Are platforms actually changing their business models? What are the sources of value, like literal value that newsrooms need to kind of monetize? And I think perhaps most interesting, how do these different models compete and intersect with one another at different times? So I'm currently writing a book draft tentatively titled Platform Dependency and the Business of News, and I'm working through these ideas now. It argues that the news media are becoming dependent on platforms. Now, this is not a novel argument. I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. There's great work by Emily Bell and Mirja Mialati who make similar claims. But what I want to do in this book is a few things. I want to establish a conceptual framework. So what does dependency actually mean, particularly in the context of the press? So, we've spoken a lot about algorithmic dependency or dependency on traffic, that, news organizations need to publish content on social platforms so people can access that content. I think this is an emerging problem rather than something that's critical today. I mean, it's definitely going to be a problem into the future. But what I find more pernicious, and again, potentially more relevant for Pern, is the various economic dependencies that are emerging from this relationship. So in Australia, you might be aware we had a big news media bargaining code reform, which has now legislated in a weird roundabout way that Google and Facebook need to pay certain news organizations for news. So this directly implicates platforms into the ongoing sustainability of news organizations. There's also an ongoing reliance, surprisingly, still on advertising for news organizations. We saw that in the COVID collapse when advertising was pulled out of the market and news organizations followed, which kind of points to the ongoing reliance on the concentrated supply chain of Google in terms of their online advertising supply chain. Fascinating developments, happy to chat about this. And, I think as well, there's also a move towards subscription models, which potentially changes other elements of that too. So I'm thinking through all these ideas, really happy to chat through that. And I think, just to end by connecting with Angèle's work again, I really think these questions of variance across markets in terms of practices, but also business models and strategies is really worth discussing further.
Thanks so much, James and Angela, for those introductions. They're fantastic. So yeah, I'll open it up to the room for questions and comments, and also, feel free to jump in at any stage. We try to keep it kind of casual and informal. Keen, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, I was just going to start by throwing a question at both of you, because I think that both of you kind of are addressing this, obviously, is really to do with attention, right? So this notion of attention, engagement, and what is its meaning? What is the meaning of it? And how do we understand this idea of an attention economy? And does that attention economy make any sense? And it's something I puzzled with. Does it make sense to talk about an attention economy? And then how do different types of attention matter, or different types of engagement matter? And what does that mean when we think about this attention economy? So there's a lot of different things there, but yeah, start big maybe.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think so. It's interesting because I've been kind of struggling with this concept of attention economy. I'm more or less on board with the concept of platform economy. I mean, I also have my own kind of things. So I'm just like, well, what does it mean? Like, what is a platform anyway? So, but attention economy even more so, I think. So let me give you perhaps my answer to this, which may or may not be a particularly full answer. So, okay, for me, it's not so much a matter of an attention economy, it's more the matter of an advertising-based economy, right? And so when we talk about attention, in fact, we talk about the metrics measuring attention that are then used by platforms to sell advertising space. So, I mean, it's kind of a constructivist definition, I realize, right? It's like, I don't really care about attention per se. I start with the metrics that measure it. And as you say, there are, as I think the kind of like platform ecosystem is getting more and more complex, the number of metrics or the different ways in which you can measure attention are like multiplying. So I will add to that a direct kind of counterpoint, which is that, I've been looking a lot into the history of advertising recently, which is a really interesting space that's like somehow most of the social sciences don't bother to study, which to me is fascinating. Like, how come so I'll talk about sociology, which is a discipline I know, right? How come most sociologists don't give a damn about advertising and marketing, which at the end of the day sustains a giant chunk of the economy. Anyway, so that's a tangent. But looking at the history of advertising and marketing, there have been a million different metrics for measuring it for at least a century and a half, right? So that's kind of a short parenthesis saying that there is obviously a history to this. But in the case of platforms, so you have a whole range of metrics. You have everything going from the most kind of basic metrics, which are page views, to unique visitors, to kind of engagement metrics such as likes, shares, retweets, comments, all of that kind of stuff, to loyalty metrics such as number of subscribers, numbers of followers that are supposed to be a bit more sticky kind of over time, right? And as such deemed at least by people, by individuals who are like producing content for platforms, deemed to be like more, they weight a bit more, right, than the other platforms. And then finally, you have, shall we say, what's called in this delightful kind of expression, quality metrics. So in the case of journalism, quality metrics are typically time engaged. And so there has been kind of a shift for trying to switch the basic metrics that's being used to sell advertising on kind of news websites, from number of unique visitors, which is a basic metric, to time engaged on any given article, right? And the idea behind it is that it's a better metric because on average, online users are spending less than a minute on any news article, which is always a number that depresses most journalists, right? It's like everybody leaves after reading the first paragraph. It's like, okay, great, like that's a great day's work. So I'm sure that, if we looked at that kind of metrics for academic articles, we would probably have even worse results. So, that's something else to take into account. But so the idea was that by switching to time engaged, like looking at how long users are staying on a given website, not only do you incentivize quality journalism, but you also can make a good pitch to advertisers that the longer a user is looking at a given page, the more likely they are to remember or to process consciously or unconsciously the ad that's being served on the side of the page. So I realize this is kind of a descriptive answer to your question, which was more theoretical, which is what is attention. And what I'm saying is that there are a ton of different ways to measure attention, but at the end of the day, it all depends on how you want to sell it for advertising purposes. And so perhaps I'll just stop there.
I'm also going to avoid the concept in theory, but I do want to ground it in news, I guess. And I think what I find really fascinating about the attention economy is there's these kind of presumptions about what it does to news media markets as well. And I like decentering platforms from this kind of narrative. There's obviously the obvious changes that, newspapers like broadcast television, etc., didn't have to fight for attention, and now they have to, because the exponential growth of media is a fact, and cultural products generally. One thing that's really interesting, I think, is the fiction of the news model, at least with news. And the Angèle points to it with Times Engaged, but this fiction that back in the day, everybody did pay attention to news. And as Angèle's already pointed to, much of what sustained that market was really just the relationship between audiences and advertisers and different form of attention metrics that emerged over time, rather than the facts of readers, actually reading anything. I think what's really telling in Australia, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere, that circulation metrics in terms of print, barring the actual decline of print, were just eventually removed because newspaper companies just gave over print publications during that mid-2000s decline to universities or other kind of different sort of institutions to just hand out newspapers. So, if you've got newspapers going to schools, that's like great, another 100,000 readers or whatever. And those attention metrics start to lose value because, advertisers start to realize that, a newspaper in every teacher's bucket each day is doesn't necessarily mean a valuable reader. I think as well, what I'm always interested in, I don't have an answer to this, is from our studies, there's a kind of a confluence of demographics and practice here as well. If you look at traffic reports to news sites, like social and search is really dominant, but for particularly legacy news outlets or early digital news outlets, a lot of people still access these sites directly, right? They don't go through platforms, they don't go through the side door. Which means that for advertisers, there are still an older demographic of people who are accessing news sites and can be transferred to sell their attention on. Obviously, that's changing. The Digital News Report, recently has pointed out that young people are even less likely to access news directly, are more likely to go through the side door. I'm still fascinated, though, and I think we don't know whether this is a kind of chronological change or point of critical juncture, or whether this is just the classic age-old story of young people not really caring about news and gradually becoming more interested in it. And I think, to wrap up, this kind of goes back to that fiction, which is like, who paid attention to news in the first place? A lot of news was tacit. A lot of news was the newspaper on the side of the street or what have you. So when you start getting into those questions of value, these kind of questions of demographics, these questions of history can get translated really awkwardly into this kind of model that we call the attention economy.
I love this. If I can just follow up on this, I think that's a question of what does the concept of attention economy do, in kind of historical terms, right? And in terms of what are the kinds of values embedded in using such a concept? And, I'm really kind of torn. I think on the one hand, very much in line with what James was saying, it's oh, listen, this is the age-old, kind of moral panics, what are the young people doing? They're not paying attention. When I was young, I was reading the New York Times, from first page to last page, and I was really paying attention. People really cared. Well, you're just yeah. Anyway, lots of thoughts about that. But so I think that there is that definitely where you're just there has always been a competition for the eyeballs of customers, and certainly in the news business as well. At the same time, it's true, and it's something that I took quite a bit in my book, and in my current work on influencers is even more striking. There is a switch in practices within content producers, within newsrooms, but also influencers, in the sense, for example, that for newsrooms, it's very striking. There is a development of lots of tactics that I call in the books the invisible work of visibility, right? So a whole range of small tactics in order to optimize the chance that your articles will go viral online. And so that goes from, SEO, so search engine optimization kind of stuff, which James, you talk about in one of your articles, to, just reposting the same article with different headlines or different leads on Facebook, every 3 hours, hoping that one of them will catch up, right? And will be picked up by online users and by the recommendation algorithms of Facebook. So, just reposting constantly, almost like a half regurgitated kind of sayings that you keep posting, hoping that it will catch fire, right? A lot of the same tactics, obviously, on Twitter. And so I think that, it's just kind of interesting that obviously, even regardless of how critical you are of the concept of attention economy, there is all of these tactics regarding online visibility and platform visibility that are now completely embedded and part and parcel of what journalists have to do. But look, not only journalists, right? As academics, for example, when we publicize talks or when we publicize article publications, we kind of do the same thing. And as someone who's spending kind of too much time on Twitter these days, I can say that I'm basically doing the same tactics that journalists are doing, right? And so obviously it trickles down. It's not only news organizations. We're all engaged in this kind of invisible work of visibility.
Can I follow up? Unless someone else has got a question.
I think Layla had a
okay.
No, you can follow up. I have a slightly different question.
Oh, okay, thanks. So I guess my follow-up question is, to what extent do you think that the attention economy, I guess, is attention itself it obviously is a term of the social actors involved. It's not necessarily, an analytical term, but to what extent does that then reflexively shape their understanding of it, I guess, and the search for attention? And to what extent just thinking there's the obvious truism here where we maybe in the past we paid more attention because there was less things to pay attention to, and to what extent then do news organizations reflexively think about something like that to try and pull back on creating news, because the less you produce, actually, the more potentially that people will pay attention to it, and the more valuable and quality it will become. But I don't know whether that's like in the field, as it were, whether social actors are thinking like that reflexively, or whether that's just yeah.
I can't speak for like quantum. I don't know about how that relates to the production of news in particular numbers, but I think there is a sense that news organizations are thinking carefully about how to manage these different, I guess, engagements with kind of media ecosystems. I guess like it's an obvious point to make, but I think what's been really noticeable is the emergence of populism and sensationalism as a genre. And I think what's particularly telling there, and we've all seen that with the kind of Wall Street Journal drops, is the mobilization of attention by a range of kind of, right-wing conservative news organizations. I think what, as a counterpoint to that though, I think it's kind of different modes of less, more centrist perhaps engagements with intention. So, and I think, kind of the work that Angèle's done and other kind of journalism scholars points to this constant balance between editorial and analytics, right? This idea that you're constantly in balance between editorial decision-making and analytics. Speaking to people at The Guardian, we had a good long conversation about their kind of internal platform and the extent to which that OFAN and the extent to which they use a range of metrics to balance what gets put forward and how that gets circulated across the web. Obviously, The Guardian is a much closer relationship to certain editorial policies and the way they frame their stories. But also, I think even the use of stuff like SEO is really fascinating, because it's not always the case, in contrast to kind of organizations like Fox News, for example. It's not always the case that the most sensational story is ideal for attention or visibility post-viral, right? So if you're looking for SEO, you might be looking for a long tail story, which gets all the right keywords, and for a range of different searches will emerge in that first page. And that's less about that first impact, but more about that consistency of its response to, different keywords. And I was speaking to journalists, and it's quite fascinating to think that they're like, yeah, when I write a headline, like SEO is baked in to my brain. So I think as well, yes, there's reflexivity about attention, but I think there's also different modalities of attention. Like, yes, there's sensationalism, but there's also editorial judgment, but there's also kind of these social technical relationships where things like SEO are less about, they can be, sure, about sensationalism, but they can also be about kind of very careful socio-technical decision-making about how what I write interfaces with particular algorithmic systems.
James, just to jump in, sorry, I'm just thinking for the live audience as well. You address in your articles this kind of pivot to SEO, so search engine optimization. Are you able to just kind of map out the kind of argument that you track there in your articles?
Yeah, I think it's quite funny because it's a constantly changing beast here, but I think, we spoke to a lot of news organizations immediately after the January 2018 Facebook change, right. Which, for a range of things. First, it was Facebook stepping away from news post 2016 election, realizing that news was a particularly kind of controversial topic of us, along a range of other things. As we saw as well, as I mentioned earlier, that change we've since realized has, supported more populist content. But at that point, a lot of news organizations were sort of thinking, well, Facebook's not the time for me. And to be fair, while legacy news media organizations are always kind of careful about Facebook, it's fair to say that a lot of people drank the Kool-Aid, and Facebook was a dominant distribution platform for a lot of companies, and people were increasingly orienting towards Facebook post 2018. We were speaking to people still in that moment of transition, and a lot of them were turning back to Google and saying, well, we can't get visibility on Facebook. We'll look to Google and get visibility on Google. And the core mechanism by which you do that is careful use of SEO tactics. And subsequent to that, and there's also been a move towards subscription and, a discussion about maintaining, subscription and building that revenue stream as well. So those are kind of two dominant, and I guess the third thing to point as well is this isn't like a full move from Facebook. What I was really fascinated by was a young youth publisher, just moving to Instagram, right? Which is obviously a Meta property now. So, it's leaving the Facebook product. It's not always leaving Facebook or Meta as it's now known. And it's definitely not always leaving platforms.
Right. No, that's really helpful. And yeah, I mean, it's part of your kind of, I think something that's consistent across both your works is this kind of counter narrative or counter argument that you both put forward. So I might just check out. Lally, did you have a question? You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I'm curious. So on the one hand, it's clear that like the metrics and the use of platforms are to mainly the primary purpose is to get more clicks or get more visitors, and that gets some better advertisements, I suppose. But I'm just wondering, in your research, have you noticed any noticeable any kind of difference in the approach in their relationship with metrics between subscription-based newspapers and ad-based newspapers? Are their relationship with metrics kind of differ because of that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. Yeah, definitely. And I think, so here I want to add like two dimensions. The first one is that there is obviously a difference depending on the business model of the economic model of the news organization under consideration. And then there is a change over time too, which actually kind of maps pretty nicely into the more quantitative piece that James shared. So first, like, difference, like obviously, your relation to metrics and your relationship to platforms is going to look pretty different, depending on whether you have a subscription base or not, right? So if you're only relying on advertising revenues, basically you're looking for number of unique visitors. So you want a highest possible number of unique visitors. You don't really care if it's the same visitors. They can be like, different visitors. You don't really care where they come from. I mean, you care a bit because the socio-demographic characteristics of your visitors shapes the price that you're able to charge for advertising space, right? So you still want like richer visitor, please, like that would be nicer. But except for that, you don't really care where they come from. You just want, you want like 5 million per month, and that's kind of your target, and that's kind of what you need to reach. And as an editor-in-chief of one of these kind of advertising-based publications, like, you're just like, we need to grow from that kind of base number of unique visitors. If you're a subscription publication, things look pretty different because you don't really care about readers coming from wherever. What you want is subscribers, right? And you want to keep your subscribers happy because you want them to resubscribe. So it's a very different thing in the sense that you're looking for a base of like loyal readers, and you're not that interested in, for example, articles going viral outside of your base of subscribers, first because they're going to hit a paywall or whatever. But what you really want is you want to funnel them into the subscription model, right? So you want, like, basically to use a Facebook lingo, you want like lookalike audiences to your already existing subscribers. You want more of the same kinds of people who are already subscribing to what you're doing. So that's the first thing. And that's definitely something that I did. So I did field work. I did ethnographic field work at a major legacy newspaper in France that also has a very strong online presence. There aren't so many of them. And that was very much the nature of the games there. They were building their subscription model, and they were just really trying to figure out how to get their readers to be loyal to the newspaper. And then you get into considerations of brands, right? It's like, how do you keep the brand of the news organization while adjusting to the digital age? And that's exactly, for example, if you look at what the New York Times is doing right now, what's happening. A side note here, which is that when news organizations do that, by the way, they turn themselves a bit into platforms. right? Because in fact, they are also in the model of stockpiling data, curating content algorithmically on their kind of homepages, etc., and then selling that data to advertisers. So, just a side note, and that I guess would be one question for James, which is like, I think, yeah, so, okay, let me finish and then I have a further question for James. The second aspect is a kind of historical component. And here I think that basically we've seen a big change over the course of the 2010s. In the sense that, the period between 2010 and 2015 looks pretty different from the period from, let's say, 2016 to 2021. Basically, 2010 to 2015 is a kind of like platforms on steroid, right? It's like all the news organizations are like, oh, social media is crazy, Facebook is so important, social news, like articles going viral, Twitter is crazy, how do we do this? Like, we don't know how to do this. And that's when I did field work, where basically journalists were just like, what is happening? I have no idea. After 2015 and 2016, I would say probably like, Trump election, like, rise of the far right, beginning of the techlash, or the kind of like backlash against kind of platforms and digital technologies in Silicon Valley. And then I would say consolidation and institutionalization of business models that are in the age of platform, right? So instead of like the kind of throw things on the walls and see what sticks, suddenly, like, gradually news organizations are a bit more like, okay, so let's be a bit smarter about this than we've been, and change that. And so I think that like since 2016, things have changed a bit. And what you've seen, and that's some things that James shows very well, is that all the kind of clickbaity sites have basically collapsed. So, BuzzFeed, Upworthy, they just like, and when I was doing fieldwork, these were the mean, aggressive, hungry, bad guys. They were the ones who were taking it all. And, 10 years later, they're not really around anymore. Just turns out it wasn't sustainable. Or it wasn't sustainable because Facebook changed its algorithms and because, the platform ecosystem kind of evolved. And so that just kind of puts them in the red. Instead, what you've seen is a kind of consolidation of a kind of winner takes all kind of system, where it's basically the New York Times, the Guardians, Le Monde, like, you name a the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, like, Washington Post, whatever, who are themselves becoming like platforms, right? They're becoming little empires, stockpiling data, curating content, and just like being super visible on social media, but with the idea of like aspiring users to their own subscription models. I guess I'll just stop there, but I guess like that would be my question for James, which is, I think that reading your two articles, one may conclude, which I think is not what you say, but I would actually be curious about that, may conclude like, oh, the Facebook age is gone. It's like Facebook and news, it was like a moment until like 2000. So you say 2018, I would probably put it a bit earlier, but your quantitative findings shows this kind of, differential effect after the change in the algorithm in 2018. But for me, it's just that like platforms have basically at this point, when they went underground in many ways, right? It's like all the kind of like ad business goes through platforms. All the kind of like tracking business goes through platforms. News organizations themselves are becoming more like platforms. And so, perhaps Facebook itself is less important in news just because, other platforms have emerged, like Instagram, whatever, like all of this stuff, Instagram, which belongs to Facebook. But it's just like it became less visible, perhaps. But I wouldn't say that makes it less important. Anyway, I was just curious about your thoughts about that.
That's a really great question, and I absolutely would agree with that kind of framing. I think in those articles, what I was trying to do is just track the decline, and that's it, and be like, the kind of primary question there was the algorithm change happened, what happened after, right? And not much beyond that. But I think, there's kind of two elements there. One is absolutely what I'm trying to do in this bigger work is I think potentially exactly that, like narrate that story of like, even though news organizations are kind of, quote unquote, moving beyond Facebook, and their top line is like, we've got these subscriptions, we've got all these other things, we don't need these guys anymore. What we're really seeing is a range of subtle, more kind of sustained reliance on platforms in many ways, on one hand, whether that's payments directly to news organizations, whether that's the kind of forms of, what Emily Bell calls patronage from Google News Initiatives or Facebook Journalism Project, or you know, what we see in terms of like the, you know, despite the move to subscription, still like a massive reliance on advertising income, therefore a reliance on Google's supply chain. But what I really love is what you talk about news and platforms, and it's also kind of what I wanted to ask you is you know, I think we see that with stuff like the Washington Post. They're basically rolling out like an ad platform, essentially trying to, if not directly compete with you know, Google and Facebook, at least like chunk out some of that market and roll out their ad platform to smaller local news agencies. You know, that's really, we're seeing the kind of emergence of platform as business model, which is not a novel statement, but I think it's interesting and novel, as Angèle points out, in the context of news, that this is still like an emerging, maturing phenomena. And I know your kind of work, you were kind of looking at a kind of scrappy French startup of the same as an American, but I wanted to hear, you know, because I'm just seeing this divide generally, right? You know, like advertising platforms, the types of payments that companies get, you know, mainly the large companies get these payments, you know, and obviously I wonder if there's a similar divide in terms of bespoke metrics, et cetera. Like obviously Guardian, et cetera, have lots of kind of capacity, but do you have any kind of idea if smaller news organizations are able to kind of do that kind of careful work with metrics, perhaps even with less income and revenue, et cetera?
So I might just chat, yeah, Angèle, it'd be great if you could respond, and then maybe we'll go to get Lotte in there.
Yeah, I mean, the long and the short of it is that it's really complicated, right? Because developing technological systems is very expensive, and especially bespoke technological systems is very expensive. So it's only basically the most prestigious and wealthy and endowed news organizations that do that. The other ones use kind of off-the-shelves tools such as Chalkbeat and Parsley and Google Analytics and Omnichurch and a couple of others, which, you know, are just like much less fine-grained and typically regardless of what they say they're doing. In fact, they are like pushing towards clickbait, regardless of, you know, and we can probably debate about this. And, you know, if their PR team was there, they would not agree with my statement, but I kind of stand by it. So, you know, so it is complicated. At the same time, again, I mean, I think, you know, and it's something that I talk a lot about in my book, metrics, audience metrics are an ambiguous object. They're an ambiguous object because they do represent several things at the same time. And that reflects the nature of journalism in itself, which is that it's both a for-profit business and it's also in the business of shaping public opinion. And so as such, audience metrics are about commercial pressures, and that's very true because that's where advertising comes from, but it's also about public relevance, right? What is a news article if no one reads it? And so I think that, you know, due to that kind of ambiguous nature of metrics, even small news organizations can potentially use metrics to kind of get a better sense of what their readers are interested in. And that doesn't necessarily lead towards clickbait. You know what I mean? So I have this one example, which is an example that I like in one of the newsrooms I studied. And sorry, I'll be very brief, but in one of the newsrooms I studied, they realized by looking at metrics at Chalkbeat actually is that they had a small group of readers who cared a lot about this very specific thing in France, which is called public finance. Public finance is the kind of Bercy ministre de l'économie, ministère du budget, where basically it's about kind of the state, like public accounting. And, you know, super technical topic, very unsexy. Turns out there was like 2,000 readers who cared deeply about that thing and who were just going nuts about it. And the metrics reflected that. And so following up on that, the newsroom decided to devote a journalist to that beat. And turns out that a lot of the readers were actually employees of the ministry. And so they were able to break like quite a number of news. And, you know, all in all, like great win for quality journalism, thanks to metrics. So, you know, it's not, I mean, I'm not too much of a determinist on that. Stuff.
So good, great exchange by the two of you. Lotte, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating to listen to. I have a question of more about the content, which you almost implicitly speak all the time about the written word. But what about, you know, pictures? Can you say something how they have played a different role during the time you have been studying this, and also how the algorithms perhaps treat them?
Yeah, so it's something that it's funny, I actually regretted I didn't end up talking that much about content in my book. And I think that as a sociologist of cultural production, like it's kind of hard to keep like kind of structural analysis of the cultural production process and then more like in-depth analysis of what's being produced, right? And anyway, so it's something that I've always struggled with. But let me tell you about a couple of things. So the first one is that obviously, and James also shows that in his articles, there has been a turn to more visual kind of forms of content, right? And that's, for example, the rise of like slideshows. So, 20 pictures of like beautiful beach houses. But not only that, right? Also videos, podcasts, so like audio-visual forms of content tend to perform better, or at least they don't hurt, they kind of help to get articles to go viral. And so there's been kind of a move towards kind of implementing much more of these types of formats, so like very picture-driven with like, soundtracks or like, some kind of podcast exchanges, etc. Within the news production process. The one caveat that I would say there is that, I wouldn't completely be on board with an argument that would say like, oh, it has become much more audiovisual. I mean, it has in some way, obviously, but at the same time, again, if you look at the history of journalism in the late 19th century, and for example, the yellow newspapers, it was like a lot of like big images of like, couples kissing and like boats sinking and like, war scenes and everything you can think of. So the move towards kind of sensational images is definitely not a new one. I mean, in a way you can think that it's more cyclical, right? So just probably that's that.
Yeah, I won't talk for too long, but I think one thing that Jean was already gestured to is that like images, particularly for Facebook, are a key variable in how the algorithm kind of understands or the algorithms, I should say, understand and process. So at particular points in my field work, people were saying that like at one point Facebook was counting things like click-throughs. So how many clicks per kind of image or whatever. So slideshows become a really important format to generate kind of visibility in the algorithm. A much more publicized one is the obvious and hilarious pivot to video, where again in my field work, people were quite openly saying, yeah, we just went out and bought a lot of cameras because we wanted to produce video content. So these were quite, I should say, in many cases, quite young digital natives. So as we've been speaking about, we're very much aligned to the kind of demands of Facebook's algorithmic systems. But yeah, as Angel's already mentioned, but I just wanted to highlight the work of Edward Herkham and his kind of theorization of social news, which is in one sense trying to understand what is this genre of news that has emerged as a result of social media, so BuzzFeed and etc. It can function as its own genre, but also as Angel's pointed out, it has a long legacy. So I think part of this as well is, in this moment, 2010s, 2015, there was a big debate about was what BuzzFeed was doing or other kind of local iterations actually journalism. They rely heavy on pictures, they rely on acronyms, etc. And I think it's also about kind of arguing that this interaction between news and social media platforms is in itself also a valid kind of expression of reporting or journalism or what have you.
Right. Janet, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, no, just thank you both. First of all, this is just really fascinating conversation, and I'm learning a lot. I'm sort of going to bring us back to Kian's first question, and maybe this kind of wraps up, I'm hoping, a lot of what you've both said. So there's like this idea, it seems like we've been skirting, or you've been skirting around this kind of idea that there's perhaps kind of a demise of the attention economy, but the attention economy was always sort of a bad notion anyway. But Kian's, we had a discussion with Kian last time or the time before, I can't remember, but attention, his research shows, is a metric on balance sheets, right? So I'm wondering, like, I just find this fascinating, like, could it be that even though in the practice of of platform media journalism, the attention economy always was maybe not a useful notion for a social scientist, and that there were practices that journalists kind of, well, as Angèle's work shows, sort of pragmatically, right, use these metrics to maintain some kind of journalistic professionalism, and you both show that actually, but that attention still is this metric, and I'm wondering even for a subscription-based model, right? And so I guess my point is, and I'm not asking you to comment on that, but my point is like, part of what the years of work with this group has sort of been about is that there are these various forms of data. So contrary to like the surveillance capitalism mode of thinking about all this, like you have data on apps, you have search engine data, transactional data between operating systems, right? There's like the list could go on. And then also, as really you both show, right, there are various forms of value, right? There's revenue streams, there's like the market capitalization of the various firms, there are asset classes that are developed from data sets or machine learning on data sets, et cetera. So there are these like myriad and sometimes competing and sometimes complementary forms of value. And I think what we need, and this is why I find both of, like, I'm not at all a media journalism person, right? But I find really, really interesting is the way that your work, both of your work accounts for the ways that like these various forms of data and value result in constant shifts in business strategies and models. Whereas I think, in the social sciences or, anthropology or sociology or media studies or whatever, we tend to think that there's like a business model and it's quantification and it's metrics and it's like eating into, our social lives, And so I think what's really, really interesting is the way that you're showing these sort of constant shifts. So sort of the question I'm getting at, and you might not have an answer, so just a comment is fine, but is the extent to which other models are emerging that are linking or as these firms become platforms themselves that are linking to commerce and payments, and the extent to which they're becoming part of like just decentralized finance. So I don't know how true that would be for the New York Times, although they do have a lot of other kinds of things you can pay for. But certainly if for Facebook, let's say, the attention economy, it's saturated, you can't get any more eyes or people sticking to it, right? So they're like moving out of information and content and into payments and commerce because they can leverage those like I don't even know how many billions of subscribers. Like it's an already constituted platform for payments and certainly for international payments. So I'll stop there. I'm just curious if you have comments about that, or because it seems like your work really kind of starts to show us that. So.
Okay, so I have lots of ideas. I have so many ideas. Okay, but interestingly, based on what you were saying, somehow I'm thinking more about my current work on influencers, right? So let me say one thing. So when you say and what Keen was saying, like attention is a line on the balance sheet, right? So that for influencers the equivalent is communities. Like communities are monetizable. Communities is what you make your bread and butter from. And so I kept being kind of mind boggled because they kept using the word communities in every single interview I've done. Like they mentioned the word community, my communities, it's such a great community. My followers are such an amazing community of warm, kind of good people. It's like amazing communities are great. And then without missing a beat, they would be like, and that's how I monetize my community. So I sell them stuff. I do like influencer marketing things where, you have brands paying me to, kind of promote this pen to my community. And, because my community loves me and they trust me, they're going to buy this pen. And turns out there are all of these payment systems that allow you to shop within platforms. So, a lot of this, so like the leader on this is Instagram, Facebook, Instagram. The second really good one is TikTok, which is kind of growing fast as a payment and shopping system. And so you have this whole systems where basically you're shopping within the app. And if you've ever done some late night shopping on Instagram, which I have to admit I have done, you can realize that it's a really seamless experience. You can buy a nap dress within like 30 seconds, it's just like, and it ships to your house you know, thanks to the good old friends of global logistics within 48 hours. And so I think that that's really, and so a part of my work on influencers, I've been doing a lot of interviews and fieldwork with marketing agencies, analytics platforms, like so all the intermediaries that are connecting brands with influencers for marketing campaigns. And they see that as the next big move, not only in advertising, but in global commerce. It's within app shopping, what's called social shopping or social commerce. And so that's exactly kind of what you're talking about, right? That like things are like moving in this very sinuous way, and it's not exactly what Zuboff is talking about, where it's like surveillance capitalism is like spreading in this kind of, you know, unidimensional way. It's more sinuous, but it is definitely growing. And it kind of, the more, you know, in this quest for attention and engagement, it kind of moves seamlessly towards payments, just because that's kind of where it tends to go. It's kind of the best path, you know what I mean? So anyway, it's more of a comment than an answer, but I very much kind of agree with that framing.
Yeah, and just to jump on that, I think as well, like that kind of community model can also be really brought back to the newsroom as well. And well, not the newsroom, but the news business model. I think, you know, we've kind of already gestured to this before, but, you know, there's a great quote from Brian Morris at DigiDay, which says, you know, a newsroom now is really like a band. So you don't just have like, you don't just have the show, right? You've got the CD, you've got the T-shirt, you've got the collectible vinyl and whatever. So I think in a way, you know, if we think about news, you know, big news companies as platforms, if we think about, you know, they're really going through different business models. So it's funny, I think you mentioned the New York Times, Janet, because, you know, they bought Wirecutter to establish, you know, essentially affiliate marketing now. So, you know, there are really, so now, you know, they're recommending products. It's obviously got quality involved, but they take a cut from purchases made through that kind of platform. So you start to live a kind of New York Times kind of life, right? You go to the events, you buy the affiliate marketing, you wear the T-shirt, etc. But I think as well, you know, in addition to that, I think there's also a difference between strategy and business model in this way. I think what I've really been fascinated by is that despite all of this diversity, all of the move towards subscriptions, and in many cases, as I've kind of mentioned earlier, there's still this kind of institutional inability to move beyond what is an advertising attention economy business model. So, you know, the New York Times can make this move towards community because it's the New York Times. They've got a big subscription revenue. You know, they're fine. But this translation is often happening in strategy meetings, in presentations, but it's not always reflected on the balance books, right? Or the revenue. The revenue is still classic eyeballs to advertisers, which as we've kind of discussed is getting harder to do.
Thank you both. I think Emma has.
Yeah,
do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I in my own mind see the connections between this question and the conversation that's happening, but they might just be my own, you know, made up connections. But I'm thinking a little bit about the limits of the attention economy, about the fact that this is like something that is an actor category, and do we want to take it up as an analytic category, concerns of this group, which have been in some ways about the kind of relative utility of older languages from the social sciences and the humanities for understanding what is novel or not about the digital economy, and so on and so forth. So it's in that spirit that I'm asking this question. And one of the things that seems kind of, or I guess the question is like, do we need to return to some old language actually in some ways to think about something like charisma, like and like charismatic numbers that would allow us to think about Keynes balance sheets, right? The different performativity of numbers there, as well as the kind of what is called the attention economy, the ways in which the aggregation of users is like mobilized as a prospective source of value in the future. So I guess, yeah, so the question is sort of like, you know, and what seems, so I'll just say one more thing. What seems interesting to me about this possibility is that, and I just had to look this up. It's been a long time since I've read Weber, but but there are three types of authority in his estimation, right? You have charismatic authority, bureaucratic authority, and traditional authority. And it seems to me that one of the things that's really, really powerful about this moment that we're talking about is the boundaries between those and who holds the power, right, have really been collapsed. So I'm wondering if, I guess I'm just asking for a reflection on like whether you think we need a new kind of conceptual vocabulary, whether charisma might generate a kind of opening of space that sort of thinks about the regulatory arbitrage, the forms of boundary crossing that Janet was talking about, payment structures versus, versus advertising versus the service that's ostensibly being offered. And I guess sort of in general, whether something like charisma might be relevant. Also thinking about your work with social influencers, right? That they're trafficking in charisma, right? But the platforms too are trafficking in the charisma of that person actually being efficacious, and so are the ad companies. So I'm just sort of thinking about, or wanting to think with everyone in this room about the ways in which kind of there's something in maybe something like charismatic metrics or charismatic algorithms, or the modalities by which affect is kind of generated. Also thinking of Janet's work about kind of about the ways in which remittances are translated into different rates of borrowing for sovereign states, and that actually has to do with the kind of charismatic reconfigured charismatics of what balance sheets look like. So just sort of, yeah, there's something in there about quantification, affect, metrics that I just would love to hear your thoughts on. Sorry, it's not formulated very well as a question, but just for some reason this is coming up to me.
That's great. But also, can I just check, Vicky, did you want to join in on any of that? Also just thinking in the interest of time. I know you had your hand up as well, or should we throw to Angèle and James?
I could just add a couple of things on the old economy and the relationship between the old and the new, to do with the shift to visuals and questions of archiving. So I've been interested a lot in my work in the relationship between image and text. And quite often when I go to do my research, I'm struck by the relationship between image and text in the hard copy of a paper. And I go back to the archives, and in fact, they don't save either the graphics or the images, or they change the images. The images are many times have been changed. And so I'm not sure what, I'm surprised at that. So I'm surprised about the instability of visuality in relation to text. They're not seen, they might be used as bait in a way, but they're not seen as deserving archiving. At least so that's the papers that I use, which are mostly US papers. And then the other thing with the Times, the New York Times, so I went to watch the Times be printed. They do little tours of their printing plants. And the way that they have survived is both through Trump, but also through a really old-fashioned outsourcing of their print factory to USA Today. So that's what has made them financially viable, it used to be, which is an insane system, no sharing of the machinery. Each paper would have its own printing thing, and then the New York Times did a big contract with USA Today, and so that's what has kept them afloat. So it's pretty old tech. It's like, it's literally like this machine cranking away. It's pretty fantastic tour, I'd have to say too. But so it's just, I guess, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Janet.
No, I was going to say the subscription to the crossword puzzle didn't save them.
I mean, I'm interested in that, like how new is the new, and what persists of the old, I guess, is one of my sort of long-standing questions.
Yeah.
I mean,
Did you want to?
Sorry.
Go for it, Angèle. Go.
So, I mean, I don't know, I'm kind of thinking back about these questions and the last couple of questions and the question in the chat as well, which are all like, I recognize the new school style. It's like, all kind of theoretical questions, like how do we conceptualize this or whatever. That's my reading of it, at least. And I think it's just so interesting, right? Because, so just to return to the concept of attention economy, I think that as if by attention economy, we mean the fact that attention has become an asset and a form of data that is valuable, I am very much on board with this. But this is not the only work that the concept of attention economy does. What the concept of attention economy does is also a kind of like moral panic about like, like everybody's just not paying attention, right? So like, so I would just be careful in using, in defining the concept. I mean, if it is about valuation, then sure, I'm on board. It's part of an economy. It's valuable and it's like datafied. Sure, like, just like be my guest and like run with it. But it comes with like all of this kind of moral kind of cloud around it, that's a moralized cloud around it, which I find more problematic. Then in terms of like, what Emma was saying, like, so should we return to like algorithms, data being charismatic, to like the kind of literature on quantification? So it's something that I've been thinking quite a lot about, in part because I was trained mostly as an economic sociologist. That's really where I come from. And then I kind of moved slowly but surely more into kind of comm and media and STS and the kind of like all kind of mixed bag of like people who study platforms. And that kind of made me think that like the literature on quantification and numbers, I mean, obviously, big fan, wrote like all of my kind of, earlier work, like kind of really engaging with that literature. But I do think that they miss something about, again, I go back to this idea of like seniorous aspect of platforms, right? And which I think really has to do with the kind of media aspect of it. And so I realize that here I'm really sounding like, someone who like turns their cloak like into kind of media studies, but there is something about the texture of platforms and their footprints and how they're kind of doing so many different things at the same time, but without necessarily saying that they're doing it, or it's unclear, and they're in this constant process of like constant kind of figuring things out. I mean, perhaps I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but I do think that there is something kind of special there that cannot be completely captured by the charisma of number, even though, I mean, I do think that a lot of the literature about platforms would benefit from a stronger engagement with a kind of quantification literature.
I might take this in a slightly different angle, but I hope it's still productive. I think I just started thinking about like the kind of charisma around the kind of social moment of the mid-2010s. And you have, these metrics, didn't just exist in their own. There's kind of, there's kind of like this moment of kind of sociality around how they get passed around, and also just about the markets more generally, where like, Vice can stand up and be like, you're losing millennials, like you need to just give us millions of dollars, and venture capitalists and Rupert Murdoch are like, sure. And it turns out that all of that money just disappears, like not disappears, is valueless like 2 or 3 years later. Like that's entirely about charisma and entirely about the kind of broader social worlds in which these kind of metrics and the metrics of places like Vice, which were going to the roof at that time, take place. And to kind of take a slightly different angle, I also think about that in terms of Facebook and Google, and we saw that in Australia in the kind of regulatory moment we're having here, which is similar across the world, where they were kind of, I think, a bit dumbfounded by, they knew it was coming, but they were kind of a bit dumbfounded because like a few years previous, they were like, cool guys, right? We're going to come in and help your government do cool stuff and text the future, etc. And particularly at these kind of, the kind of edges of the platform empire, which is very much not the, the North Atlantic, but is, the South here. They didn't really know how to deal with that. And I think even in terms of thinking about regulatory approaches, like the attention economy is not new, as we've kind of discussed, and the solutions we have to generate, sure, they might be different, but draw on stuff like telecommunications regulation, draw on stuff like financial services approaches. Like there are precedents for regulating companies that are socially important, for example, or quote unquote too big to fail. So I think both in both those senses, you have these moments of charisma, which create these kind of intersections between like capital, metrics, platforms, news markets, and then actually once you go past that, you realize actually there are longer trajectories here that we can draw on and work past that moment.
I think that's really useful because I think it suggests the need for mid-level concepts, whatever they may be, right? That it's like not, a kind of surveillance data nexus is like not totally useful for understand. I mean, a lot of what we've been discussing in this group, and other people should chime in here, is like the ways in which it's so, case specific. And yet there is something generalizable that one wants to be able to say. So like it's some kind of analytic or conceptual vocabulary that allows us to hold seemingly disparate processes together. And accounting for those differences seems, I think for this group, and again, I don't want to speak for anyone else, has been kind of a quite important theme here. So thank you.
I think you're right. If I can just follow up on that one, I was really struck by what Angèle and James were saying when they sort of highlighted the dynamic relationship between, on the one hand, platforms and news media, and then on the other hand, between those two and third parties that pop up here and there that could be either influencers or could be, other sort of actors, regulators on the one hand. And I was thinking about that specifically in one of the studies that I'm doing, which is on fake news producers, essentially, and trolls, who then end up being another sort of cog into the mechanism or the ecosystem, and then how their mechanisms then influence the choice of metrics or the choice of, what values in the system by others. So I think that's the kinds of stuff that it's not just mid-level, but shows the interaction, the tensions, the different values at play, the triangulation sometimes. And I think that's really interesting and powerful to move forward.
Yeah. Spencer, did you want to jump in with your cue? I know Angèle kind of got to it, but it's good to bring it up.
Yeah, definitely. And it kind of just follows with what Emma said, and then just more specifically around the concept, James, that you kind of stated you were looking to develop of platform dependency. So given that, there is something kind of general here, yet it's sinuous and non-monolithic, what are the kind of familiar resemblances that you've been seeing? And Angèle, feel free to hop in as well around this kind of term of platform dependency.
Yeah, no, great question. I feel this is the conversation I have in my head every day as I'm writing. I think, there's a few large trajectories we can draw globally as emerging, etc. And I've kind of mentioned them before, so I'll kind of be brief. I think, the core dependency, I think, is on Google as an online advertising supply chain, and the fact that they've got dominance across that chain. So if you want to make kind of any sort of revenue from it, you kind of have to engage with that at some point. As we've kind of pointed out, it's only larger kind of news organizations who can afford to build out of that and create the bespoke advertising platform to exit from that. This has really big impacts for news media revenue because studies from the UK's Competition Markets Authority, I think, show that there's about 50% more potentially of a random clip that gets taken out by intermediaries we don't know who as part of this transaction, and that money is just gone. It doesn't end up in the pockets of news media. An emerging economic dependency, which isn't substantive, but it's interesting, is that, Australia was just the first country of many, and obviously France with the Autorité de la Concurrence. I probably mangled that, I apologize, Angèle. And their competition finding has, payments from platforms is is a thing now, and it's being looked at seriously in Nordic countries as well as across the EU and Canada, etc. Obviously, what that infers is that there is going to be news on platforms to warrant platforms payment. So it entrenches what was a quite lightly held relationship into something that now is expected, that, you know, there's no breakaway. If we're to pay for news, they need to get something in return, that is the news on platforms. So that intensifies that further. And I think the yeah, obviously the final one is you know, and potentially quite substantive, is, you know, direct donations from platforms. And, you know, we see that to a range of parties, but even stuff like, you know, we saw Facebook and Google create COVID relief funds for news organizations. And that was, you know, good money, well received by struggling newsrooms. But it starts to situate platforms as very much part of the news media economy. So as Angèle kind of pointed to earlier, while there's been kind of this superficial break from Facebook in terms of distribution, there's a lower level of engagement and reliance.
Yeah, that's so great, James. Angèle, did you want to chime in there? And then we might wrap it up because we've got the live audience, which will be saying goodbye to it. 11:30, 7:30, wherever you are.
So I think, I mean, I was just thinking in my head about this concept of platform dependency, and it's really interesting. I think that it takes place at two different levels, and James, that might be something, you know, that you're writing about. I think the first level, which is a level at which you're kind of writing about in the articles that we read for today, is at the kind of field level. I mean, I'll say field, but you could call it industry or something else, where basically you just have these like massive platform players that are, you know, whether you want it or not, changing the rules of the game, right? And so that's like very much a kind of Bourdieuian, or could be very much a Bourdieuian story, where like it's just, yeah, a new state of the field, one that's characterized by platform dependency. I think there is another layer at which you could also use the same framework, and it's at the individual level. And obviously, I'm you know, thinking a lot about that right now as I study influencers, and as I'm writing a new book about influencers, where, you know, influencers are completely at the mercy of the platforms they work for. I mean, they work with, they work on, and they don't work for the platforms, but it certainly feels like that to them, in the sense that, you know, they all kind of, you know, complain a lot about the fact that YouTube is a bad boss. So that's the way they put it. They say like, YouTube is the worst boss. I've never had such a bad boss, because like they demonetize my videos without warning. They're discriminating against me, and they don't put me in the recommendation algorithms. I mean, they have all of these gossips and kind of complaints and conspiracy theories also about why YouTube's algorithms are doing what they're doing. And what you feel is a great sense of precarity and isolation and dependency. And so, and I think that would be probably a very important part of what should be kind of analyzed within platform dependency, because it has to do with the kind of livelihood and precarity of individual workers. And obviously, you know, we're talking mostly today about social media platforms, but there are other kinds of platforms, right? Ride sharing platforms, care work platforms, like all different kinds of platforms where you know, in different industries are just doing exactly the same thing. So yeah, so just like thinking about these two levels, this field level and kind of individual level, and like accounting for variation at these two levels. That was just where my brain was going, kind of independently.
That's so great. It's so generous, the both of you. Thanks so much. Yeah, we're coming up to time, so I think Janet will chime in, and yeah.
Yeah, just to say thank you. This was like incredibly rich conversation, really great, sort of about, you know, your work, which we've learned so much from, but also really helped our sort of ongoing conversation about value. I think just like, I think I'm sort of linking back to Emma's point about really helpful to kind of move us away from sort of totalizing theories or totalizing approaches to sort of like mid-level concepts or trying to formulate mid-level concepts. And I think Fabio had to jump off, but also this kind of point that platforms aren't self-contained with like some kind of internal logic. We read a lot that sort of implies that or actually says that or claims that. So really helpful on both of those scores. I know we're going to log off from the live streaming. So I just want to say we will post the video to the website. And thank you both for closing our year of our new salon series. Yeah, seriously. And then we will be posting mostly on Twitter about spring programming, salons for spring programming, and hope you both join us and everyone else. So yeah, thanks loads.